I'm going to tell you something that took me 77 years to understand. 50 of those years were spent running as fast as I could towards a finish line I thought was called success. I believed that on the other side of that line I would find everything that mattered: respect, security, and a deep, unshakable feeling that I was finally enough. I built a life that looked perfect from the outside: the career, the house, the titles on the door. I achieved everything I set out to do, and I'm here to tell you, with an urgency that only a man with more yesterdays than tomorrows can have, that the finish line is a ghost. It isn't real. It's a lie we tell ourselves to justify sacrificing the only thing we truly own: the present moment. I paid for that lie with my life's most precious currency, and the price was far too high. I just hope you can learn from my mistakes before you have to pay it yourself. It all started with a promise I made to a little boy. That boy was me, watching my father come home from the factory every night. He was a good man, a strong man, but he was invisible to the world. I can still smell the grease on his clothes, see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. He'd sit at the dinner table in a silence so heavy it felt like a shroud, his worn-out work boots resting by the door like defeated soldiers. Society had deemed him disposable, and he knew it. And in that silence, I made a silent vow. I will not be him. I will be someone. I will matter. That vow became the engine of my life. It was a promise born of love and fear, a desperate attempt to outrun the shadow of insignificance. It drove me to climb, to achieve, to conquer. But I was so focused on not becoming my father that I failed to see I was running straight into a different kind of prison, one with golden bars, but a prison all the same. For 30 years, my life ran on a precise, relentless schedule. The alarm would go off at 5 a.m., long before the sun had a chance to touch the windows of our sprawling, silent house. I'd be gone before my children, Mark and Emily, even stirred. My days were a blur of meetings, spreadsheets, and power lunches, all orchestrated from a corner office with a view that made the world look small and conquerable. I thought that view was the prize. I'd come home late, the smell of the city still clinging to my suit, and find dinner kept warm for me. Sarah, my wife, would try to tell me about her day, about the kids, but I'd listen with one ear, my mind already on the next day's battle. I saw my children in snapshots, a quick kiss on the forehead at bedtime, a wave from the doorway as I left for yet another business trip. I was the architect of a beautiful life that I was never actually home to live in. I was a photograph on the mantelpiece, a signature on a check, a provider of everything except myself. I remember the weight of the gold watch I bought myself after my first big promotion. It was supposed to be a symbol of arrival, of making it, but most days it just felt heavy, a constant reminder of the time I was losing, time I couldn't get back. There were so many moments I traded for a line on my resume. Emily's first ballet recital, which I watched on a grainy video because I was closing a deal in another time zone. Mark's championship soccer game, where I stood on the sidelines answering emails on my phone, my focus a million miles away. I convinced myself this was the sacrifice of a good father, a responsible husband. I was building an empire for them. But what does an empire mean to a little girl who just wants her dad to see her dance? What is a legacy to a son who just wants you to watch him score a goal? I was so afraid of my father's poverty that I embraced a different kind of impoverishment, one of the soul. He was physically exhausted. I was emotionally bankrupt. The first crack in the fortress I'd built around myself didn't come from a failed business deal or a market crash. It came on a Tuesday night in the suffocating quiet of our dining room. I was 52. I had just closed the biggest merger of my career, and I came home with a bottle of expensive champagne to celebrate. But there was nothing to celebrate. Sarah sat across from me, the food on her plate untouched. She just stared at me, not with anger, but with a kind of exhausted sorrow that was far more terrifying. The silence in that room was different that night. It wasn't the usual, tired silence of a long day. It was the silence of something ending. I tried to talk about the deal, about the numbers, about the victory, but my words were just stones dropping into a deep, dark well, making no sound. I was a king in an empty castle, and I was only just beginning to realize that the person sitting across from me was a stranger. She finally looked up, her eyes holding the weight of a decade of lonely nights and missed moments. "We live in a beautiful house, Arthur," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a siren. "But you're just a ghost that pays the bills." The words hit me with a physical force. A ghost. It was the cruelest and most honest thing anyone had ever said to me. Because she was right. I was there, but I was gone. My mind was always in the next meeting, on the next flight, chasing the next milestone. I started to defend myself, the automatic reflex of a man who solves problems with logic and power. I talked about the security I'd provided, the opportunities our children had, the life I had built for us. I was listing the features of the Golden Cage, trying to convince her and myself that it was a paradise. But her expression never changed. She wasn't listening to my resume. She was looking for her husband. That's when she delivered the blow that would echo through the rest of my life. She put her hands flat on the table, a gesture of finality. "I don't need any of this," she said, sweeping her gaze across the expensive furniture and the perfectly manicured lawn visible through the window. "I don't need the money. I don't need the house. I don't need the name you've built. I just needed you, and you were never here." It wasn't an accusation. It was a eulogy for the man she had married, for the partnership we were supposed to have. In that moment, the little boy inside me, who had made that promise at his father's dinner table, felt a tremor of absolute terror. My entire life's operating system, the belief that success would earn me love and worth, was just declared bankrupt. The foundation of my world didn't just crack, it splintered. I had won the race, but I had lost everything that mattered at the finish line. The rest of the evening is a blur of suffocating silence. She went upstairs, and I stayed in that dining room for hours, the unopened champagne sweating on the table like a monument to my failure. I looked around at the life I had assembled piece by expensive piece. The paintings on the wall, the crystal glasses, the polished wood of the table, it all felt alien, like a movie set for a life someone else was supposed to be living. Her words, "You're just a ghost," played on a loop in my head. For the first time, I didn't see a successful executive when I looked at my reflection in the dark window. I saw my father's son, just as lost, just as invisible, but in a much more expensive prison. I didn't understand it all then, not fully, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the path I was on led to a profound and desolate emptiness. The game was over, and I was just beginning to understand the price of playing. For a long time after that night, I did what any man who builds his life on a faulty foundation does. I tried to add more weight to it, hoping to force it into being stable. I worked harder. I flew further. I closed bigger deals. In my mind, I was trying to prove her wrong, to build a fortress of success so immense and undeniable that she would have to see its value. I was trying to scream, "Look at what I've done for you," without ever saying a word. But with every new achievement, every new accolade, the silence in our home grew deeper. I'd come home to a house that felt less like a home and more like a museum of a life I was supposed to be living. The ghost she had spoken of was now rattling his own chains, haunting the hallways of his own gilded prison, completely unaware that the door had been unlocked the entire time. I just had to stop trying to buy my way out and simply walk through it. The distance wasn't just with Sarah anymore, it was a disease that had spread to my children. They were teenagers then, old enough to feel the cold front that had moved into our house. I'd try to talk to Mark about his future, about college, about his career, but my advice was just the blueprint for another prison. He'd look at me with a polite emptiness, seeing not a father, but a warden. Emily would retreat into her room, the music from behind her door a clear wall between her world and mine. I was the provider of everything they owned, but the one thing they needed, a present father. I remember one evening, standing in the doorway of the living room, watching them laugh at something on television with their mother. For a brief moment, they were a family, a perfect little portrait, and I was the outsider, looking in through a window of my own making. The loneliness was a physical ache, a cold stone in my chest. The breaking point came when I was 52. I finally got it all, The CEO title, the corner office on the top floor, the name that people whispered with respect in boardrooms. I stood there, looking down at the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. This was the summit. This was the finish line I had been sprinting towards since I was a little boy, smelling the grease on my father's clothes. I had done it. I had won, and the only thing I felt was a profound, crushing, and absolute emptiness. The silence in that office was louder than any factory floor. I sat in the expensive leather chair that I thought would finally make me feel powerful, and I just felt small. The ghost had finally reached his throne, only to find it was just a chair in an empty room, high above a world he had never learned how to live in. It was a joke, a terrible, cosmic joke, and I was the punchline. The real change, the one that mattered, didn't happen in a boardroom or on a stock market ticker. It happened years later, sitting on my porch, watching the sun paint the morning sky. There were no deadlines, no calls to return, no mountains left to conquer. For the first time in 50 years, there was just silence. And in that silence, I began to hear a question that had been whispering beneath the roar of my ambition my entire life. What were you really chasing, Arthur? What was the hunger that no amount of success could ever feed? I had spent decades accumulating answers: money, respect, security, a legacy. But sitting there with the warmth of a simple coffee mug in my hands, I knew, with a certainty that shook me to my core, that all of those were lies. They were the symptoms, not the disease. The real chase was for something else entirely, something I could never have bought, no matter how many deals I closed. And then, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room, the image became clear. I saw that little boy at the dinner table again, watching his father's defeated posture. The promise he made wasn't about getting rich. It was about not feeling invisible. It was about not feeling worthless. My entire life, I was never chasing money or titles. I was chasing the feeling of being enough. That's all it ever was, a desperate 50-year sprint to outrun the shadow of my own inadequacy. Every promotion was a temporary shield. Every dollar earned was another brick in a fortress built to keep the feeling of worthlessness out. I thought if I could just build the walls high enough, if I could make the fortress grand enough, then I would finally feel safe inside. But the thing I was afraid of wasn't outside the walls. It was inside me the whole time, and it was the one who was laying the bricks. That realization was the most liberating and devastating moment of my life. It was liberating because the race was finally over. The finish line I had imagined, that mythical place where I would finally be crowned worthy, was a mirage. It never existed. I could stop running. But it was devastating because it laid bare the truth of my sacrifice. I had traded my family's laughter for a number in a bank account. I had traded my wife's presence for the approval of strangers in a meeting. I had traded my own peace for a ghost's ambition. All of it, every single choice, was in service of acquiring something that was never for sale in the first place. You cannot purchase your own worth. You cannot earn your right to be here. It was a truth so simple, so fundamental, that I had spent a lifetime complicating it with spreadsheets and strategies, completely missing the point. In that moment, I didn't feel anger. Not really. Just a profound, quiet grief for the man who had run so hard for so long in the wrong direction. I grieved for the moments I could never get back, for the man my wife deserved, for the father my children needed. And then something else began to seep in, like light through a crack in a door. It was acceptance. I couldn't change the 50 years I had lost, but I could stop the bleeding. I could stop paying the price for a promise made by a scared little boy. For the first time, I felt the weight of that promise lift from my shoulders. It was a physical sensation, as if I'd been carrying a mountain and had just been given permission to set it down. The ghost was finally letting go. The real journey, I understood then, wasn't about becoming someone. It was about unbecoming everything that wasn't really me. My first real act as a free man wasn't to sell the company or donate my fortune. It was much smaller and 1,000 times harder. I walked into the kitchen where Sarah was reading by the window, the morning light catching the silver in her hair. My heart was pounding like a drum, the same fear I felt before a billion-dollar negotiation. But this time, the stakes were real. I didn't have a speech prepared. I just sat down across from her and told her everything. Not about the deals or the long hours, but about the little boy at the dinner table, terrified of being invisible. I told her that for 50 years I had been trying to build a fortress so high that no one could ever call me worthless, and in the process I had locked her out and myself in. I didn't ask for forgiveness, I just laid the truth on the table between us, naked and fragile. She just listened, and when I was done, she reached across and put her hand on mine. It was the first time in years I felt truly seen. Rebuilding a life is quiet work. It's not a grand construction project. It's more like tending to a garden that's been neglected for decades. I started calling my son, Mark, not to talk about his career path, but to ask about the birdhouse he was building with his daughter. At first, our conversations were awkward, filled with the static of years of missed connections. But I kept showing up. I learned to just listen, to let the silence sit without trying to fill it with a solution or a check. I started having coffee with Emily, my daughter, and for the first time I heard about the struggles in her marriage not as a problem I needed to fix, but as a life she was navigating. I was no longer the CEO of our family. I was just a member, learning the language of presence. Each conversation was a single stone being placed back into a crumbling foundation. It was slow, painstaking work, but for the first time I felt like I was building something that would actually last. I used to think a legacy was something you left behind in a will, a number etched onto a plaque. Now I know that's just the residue of a life, not the life itself. My real legacy won't be the company I built, but the peace I finally found. It's in the easy laughter I now share with my wife, a sound I starved our home of for so long. It's in the way my grandchildren climb into my lap without hesitation, knowing I am fully there with them, not a ghost in a suit. I finally understood my father in a way I never could as an ambitious boy. He came home tired and silent, but he came home. He was present in his exhaustion, a quiet anchor in our lives. I had run so far to avoid his fate, only to spend a lifetime chasing a far more profound emptiness. My transformation wasn't about becoming a new man. It was about finally coming home to the one who had been there all along, buried under a mountain of ambition. I spent 50 years of my life building a resume, not a life. I collected titles, accolades, and a fortune, believing each one was a brick in a fortress that would finally make me feel safe, worthy, and significant. But a fortress is just a prettier word for a prison. The hard truth is, the world doesn't care that much about your resume. The only person you're trying to convince is yourself. And the cruel irony is that the prize I was chasing, that deep, unshakable feeling of being enough, was never waiting for me at some future finish line. It was right here, all along, buried under the noise of my ambition. It was in the quiet mornings with my wife, in the sound of my children's laughter, in the simple act of being present for my own life. I sacrificed the priceless currency of the present for a future that, when it finally arrived, was just an empty room at the top of a very tall building. So I'm telling you this, with the urgency of a man who has more sunsets behind him than in front. Please, don't make my mistake. Don't wait for the promotion, the house, or the number in your bank account to finally give yourself permission to live. The peace you are desperately chasing isn't at the top of some distant mountain. It's in the simple act of taking a breath right where you are. It's in the warmth of a hand you're holding, in the taste of your morning coffee, in the messy, beautiful, unrepeatable chaos of now. You cannot earn your worth because it was never for sale. It is your birthright. You are already enough. The only race is the one against the clock, and the only question you'll have to answer at the end isn't what you achieved, but were you truly there for any of it?